Thank you. I'd like to introduce you now to Mark Richardson. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Rich Analytics and the founder and technical lead of the HousingNowTO Affordable Housing Tracking and Transparency Project since 2019. Mark was a citizen member of Toronto's Planning Review Panel from 2015 through 2017 and is a regular collaborator on urban affordable housing innovation projects at the University of Toronto School of Cities and Toronto Metropolitan University's School of Urban and Regional Planning. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you to everyone who organized the event today and for everyone being here. I am Mark Richardson. Oliver's already introduced me. I'm going to be talking to you today about rapidly delivering new affordable rental housing in mixed income communities. So as Oliver mentioned, I was part of the Toronto Planning Review Panel from 2015 to 2017 and on the Open Data Community Advisory Board from 2017 to 2018. And for the last 5 years, I've been working as part of a pro bono professional services collective. Pro bono meaning we do it for free, we do it off the side of our desk, to try to make sure that the City of Toronto is making good, effective, smart, rapid decisions around its affordable housing strategy. So number of groups and organizations that we work with, my company, Rich Analytics. We also work with Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness, the Toronto Metropolitan Association of Planning Students, Map Your Property, Nama Blonder and her folks at Smart Density, as well as Kearns Mancini, Sweeney & Co., and then technology companies like Urban Sim, Agile Form, Future Model TO, and Squeeze. We also don't just work within our own little silos. We partner with Toronto Region Board of Trade, with the University of Toronto School of Cities, with the Toronto Metropolitan University School of Urban and Regional Planning, and we also partner with the Urban Land Institute, which is based out of Washington, D.C. They have the Terwilliger Center for Housing. So I've been on the jury for the last 3 or 4 years for their housing awards, which means I get the opportunity to travel around North America, seeing best practices in other cities, bringing them back to Toronto, bringing them back to Ontario, so that you can learn from those examples in other places around North America. So just some context slides, and hopefully you can see the slides okay. I know the screens are a little small for those of you at the back, but all these slides are going to be available as a PDF as well after my presentation. You know, we're talking about our work is mostly in the City of Toronto. We do a little bit of work in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area with some sites that are on the borders, GO stations and things like that. And when we're looking at our sites, we're almost entirely looking at City of Toronto owned lands at this time. We've started to look a little bit at provincially owned lands as well. We've also now started to partner with some faith-based groups, churches, Legion halls, temples, who are starting to come to us with asking for advice and recommendations and applying some of our student teams to their sites. We focus on government-supported affordable rental housing. What do we mean by government-supported affordable rental housing in Toronto in 2023? So we start with this chart, and this chart that goes from left to right and goes from the deepest levels of affordability in the highest areas of need, which are emergency shelters and transitional housing, as was being discussed earlier, all the way through social housing, co-ops, workforce and below market rental, purpose-built rental, affordable below market ownership, so the Habitat for Humanities of this world, and then attainable ownership, missing middle, and all the way up to single family homes. We fully understand that in the City of Toronto, within our borders, there are never going to be affordable single-family homes built ever again. We just don't have the land for it. We don't have the space for it. For those of you who are in government, the most important piece of this chart is that gray triangle, which is the level of government assistance. The deeper you want to go into the world of affordability, the more government assistance you have to provide to make that math work. So in the City of Toronto, as of the 2021 census, the total household median income was $84,000. It's a little bit more here in Waterloo Region. I think it's about $93,000 in the 2021 census. So we're looking to create housing that works for people at or below median income. So that means if you've got $84,000 a year in pre-tax household income, you can afford 30% of that to cover your rent or your accommodation. 30% of that spread over 12 months is about $2,100 a month in rent. That doesn't matter if it's a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, $2,100 is about the most you should be spending if you're at or below median income. Obviously, we have a lot of people who are much further below that income threshold. So, take that number, divide it in half, $42,000 a year. That's somebody who's working a couple of part-time jobs full-time. Is going to earn high 30s, low 40s. If you've got people who are on any kind of assistance program, some of the lower income folks in social housing and Toronto community housing, their household incomes, even for multiple person households, is only between $12,000 and $20,000 a year. So how do we provide housing that is appropriate for all of those income spectrums? You can also see from this chart that over time, the level of government assistance has moved further and further and further up the income spectrum. So when we talk about government assistance, it's not just rent vouchers or social housing, it's also first-time homebuyer tax credits, it's RSP withdrawals, savings plans. So right now, all the way up into attainable ownership in condos, you are providing some kind of government subsidy, some kind of government discount, waivers on land transfer taxes, other things in order to make that viable. That was not the way it was when I moved to Ontario 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I arrived here in an old beat-up Toyota Tercel that I drove across from Alberta when the flood of economic refugees was going in that direction rather than the heading west as they are now. And I could come to the City of Toronto, I could work a retail job. I sold filofaxes to bankers underneath First Canadian Place. And I could afford a 1-bedroom apartment in 1993 in Toronto, a basement apartment in a nice part of Cabbagetown that cost me $600 a month inclusive, except for my Rogers bill and my Bell bill, back when you had cable and landlines. That's about an $1,100, $1,200 a month unit now. If I go and look at that same apartment today, it's $2,400 to $2,600 a month to rent that apartment now. So the opportunities for newcomers, be they young people starting their careers, be they people moving into the city from Alberta or Albania or Addis Ababa, are all much more constrained because of our high housing costs in the City of Toronto. And if we don't solve our housing cost problems in the City of Toronto, the echo effect, like throwing a stone into the river, it echoes out. Our housing problems become your housing problems, become Hamilton's housing problems, because people drive until they qualify. So let's talk about the Regional Municipality of Waterloo. You've got a population in 2023 that was estimated at just under 674,000 people. On a good day, you're an hour and 15 minutes to the CN Tower. On a bad day, you're 3 hours to the CN Tower. Depends on if the Jays are playing and if the Gardeners open or not. We looked at, we used tools from the University of British Columbia, the Housing Assessment Resource Tools, or HART. We highly recommend that anybody who's interested in housing is using these. They're based on the 2021 census. And we looked at your specific targets. So this is for the region of Waterloo, not the City of Waterloo. In 2021, you had an affordable housing deficit. So for moderate income, low income, and very low income people, a moderate income household is looking for a rental unit at or below $1,860. A low-income household is looking under $1,200, and a very low-income household is looking under $500 a month. But some of those $500 a month apartments are for four-person households, right? So you've got single moms with 2, 3 kids who can only afford that $500 a month rent. How do you fill that gap in order to make it viable? So Region of Waterloo, in 2021, across just those 3 categories, you had moderate, low-income, and very low-income households. You had 19,345 households that needed to have an apartment that would rent at or below $1,800.60 a month. That's a huge gap, and it's great that we're talking about creating 2,500 units, but I can guarantee you that by the time this comes around in the next census in 2026, these numbers will be worse. And these numbers will be worse partly because household incomes were actually higher in 2021 because everyone was getting CERB payments from the government. It was the middle of COVID. So everyone was getting a couple of $1,000 a month in direct payments from the federal government that they no longer get. So some of these household incomes are actually going to drop, and the household rents have only increased over that period of time. So how do we create housing at speed and at scale in these kinds of communities at those kinds of dollar values? And for those of you who are in the room who are affordable housing providers, you need more than that $1,860 a month to cover your capital, to cover your construction, to cover your operations, to cover your heating and your electrical and your state of good repair. This is what the tenant has to pay as a maximum. This is not what your organization needs to receive in order to operate that brand new build unit. It's about filling that gap between what you need to build and operate and what the tenants can afford out of their own pocket at the end of the day. And that's where rent subsidies and other voucher or philanthropic programs come into play. So how did we start as an organization? We're going to talk about some Toronto sites. And I'm not here to be the guy from the big city telling you how to do things in Waterloo Region. Your mileage may vary. Your mileage will vary, but the sites that we've picked for talking about today are examples that are very close to the kinds of projects that we think would be appropriate in your region. I'm not talking about 900 units of co-op housing next to a subway and a GO station, because you don't have that geographic reality here. We're going to be talking about parking lots and other small sites that the City of Toronto is currently exploiting. So in 2018, there was an election for mayor and council, and at that time, John Tory was running against Jennifer Keesmaat, and they both had differing housing plans. John Tory was saying he was going to create 40,000 new units of rental housing by 2030. Jennifer Keesmaat said she was going to create 100,000 units by 2028. And our approach, because we come from the open data, open government transparency side, was we don't care who wins the election. Whoever wins the election, we're going to spend the next 4 years tracking their ability to deliver on that target that they have set. So as an affordable housing volunteer organization, we don't pick the sites, we don't pick the targets, but we're kind of going to be your soul coach, personal trainer, accountability buddies to make sure that you're doing the things every day that you need to do in order to reach those targets. So the city, John Tory won. He announced just after his election in December 2018 that they were going to release 11 city-owned sites. And all that was released at that time was this black and white PDF that you see here on the left. It was 11 sites, it was a couple of addresses, it was some targets on unit counts, it was some targets on affordable units. It was a very basic information release for the mayor's biggest affordable housing program. So our volunteers spent about 6 weeks scraping data out of a number of different government systems, working with Map Your Property and the Evergreen Foundation and the folks at Toronto Metropolitan University to create our map, which is really just a Google map. It's a Google map that lets you go and visit those sites, check them out, understand them, see them, and it works the same for you as it works for the mayor, as it works for somewhere in the Prime Minister's office. It's about open data, open government, transparency, putting that information into the hands of all citizens equally. So we launched the project on January 21st, 2019, and we didn't expect it to get a lot of traction, but we didn't expect the housing crisis to get as much attention as it has received. So as of a few weeks ago, we passed 200,000 visits to our map over 5 years. People use it all the time. I know journalists like Oliver use it. They pull it up because they're standing in a parking lot and they want to see what the city's plan for that parking lot is. It's easier to go to our map on your phone than it is to go through a bunch of black and white PDF staff reports at the City of Toronto. So it's been very successful in improving the conversation. And we're also having these conversations at sort of a grade 4, 5, or 6 level of communication, because we're dealing with a lot of people who don't have a lot of time. They may be watching a news story that's in the barber shop or in the pizza joint with the sound turned off. So we keep things very simple, very easy to communicate. We're just dealing with the strict facts of the site and whether we believe that site is viable in its current configuration. Because there's really only 3 questions in affordable housing. The questions are, does it pencil? Does this individual project make financial sense? Does it scale? Can we take this idea from 40 units to 400 units to 4,000 units? And how do we speed up delivery? Should it really take us 12 years to deliver a 60-unit seniors housing building, which is a real story in the City of Toronto? How do we break down those barriers in order to make these projects go faster through the system and achieve delivery? Nice policy does not equal successful projects. Globe and Mail actually gave us one of our very first articles in August of 2019, which said a group of local activists is warning that 3 of the 4 initial sites are not dense enough to make financial sense and risk never being built. We got a very heated call from the mayor's office that morning. And we said, just tell us what the magic trick is. Tell us where you're finding those billions of dollars that we see as currently being a hole in your project. Over time, the Housing Now program by June of 2023 has been dogged by delays, and a number of projects are still in the pipeline, but it is yet to build a single home. So we've actually now broken ground on 1 Housing Now site. We expect that the City of Toronto will break ground on 2 or 3 more during this year, mostly based on things that have changed at the federal government level. But this is not a Toronto-specific story. This is a Calgary story, it's a Vancouver story, it's a Waterloo story, it's a Victoria story. Policy only makes sense if you can stress test it against the financial realities of construction. And Joe Berridge has this great quote, and I think it's nobody's trying to make these projects hard. Joe's book, Perfect City, Joe's from Urban Strategies, and he has this great quote, "The enemy is always the blob, the congealed mess of outdated and overlapping jurisdiction, the diffuseness of responsibility, and the fact that simultaneously no one and everyone is in charge." This is the problem, and you guys have an even greater challenge because you have 2 layers of municipal government. You have your regional government and your local council governments. So every time you add that extra layer, you're adding more friction to it. The only way we've seen these projects work is if all of those stakeholders are coming around a table and are dealing with those issues and becoming blob busters. You have to fight that blob. You have to say, the way we've done things in the past, the way we've passed around responsibility doesn't work anymore. We need to change it. So we work with student teams, as I discussed. This is a perfect site, which I think is a good example for you. It's a Green Pea parking lot owned by the City of Toronto, Dundas and Ossington. So there's a streetcar that runs right in front of it. On Dundas Street, it's about 37 parking spaces plus a heritage home that's just next to it. We are tearing down a heritage home to build affordable housing. We are getting rid of 37 parking spaces to build affordable housing. Our students worked on this site back in 2020, 2021, and the city has now announced it as its mass timber affordable housing pilot site. It's going to be a 10-story building. It's going to have about 95 units in it, and it is going to have 0 replacement parking. Because digging down an underground parking space here costs about $125,000 a parking space, which means every 3 or 4 parking spaces is the equivalent to the cost of 1 new affordable housing unit. You've got transit, you've got all that accessibility on your doorstep. We cannot replace your parking at the kinds of fees that a surface parking lot in Toronto charges. Another parking lot. This one is at Sherbourne Street. If you've ever been to a concert at the Phoenix Concert Hall, this is the parking lot that's right across the street. It's 0.74 acres. You can see there's obviously towers and stuff from the 1970s that surround that building. The original plan for that site from the city was a 22-story building with approximately 216 units in it, with 108 of them as affordable rental. Our volunteers worked particularly with NAMA from Smart Density, and we said, we don't think you're squeezing this lemon hard enough to get the affordable housing numbers you need in order to get CMHC funding. You have to remember that every one of these projects has to individually go to CMHC to qualify for funding. And if CMHC thinks there's too much risk or there's not enough equity built into it, they will turn you down and they will give the money to another city and another project. So we re-looked at this, not making any changes to the design, literally just adding more floors to the building until we could make the CMHC math work. So we took it from the 22, we took it up to 25, we took it up to 27. There were some concerns about some shadow on a park. I don't know if you can see, I don't have a mouse here, but there's a little pink blob over the park, which is sort of in the middle of the screen there. But we iterated that building at the 22, at the 25, and at the 27. We said, this tiny little bit of shadow, by allowing that, will generate an additional 25 affordable housing units and make your project more viable. You may have an urban design city policy that we don't want to put shadow on parks. It's a very small shadow at a very specific time of year, at the end of March. It doesn't cover a majority of the park, but getting rid of it generates 25 more affordable housing units and makes your project viable. So is that hard line that we never put new shadow on park, is that a viable choice if affordable housing is your priority? So the city met us halfway. The city came in at 25 stories with now 266 units, 133 are market rental, 133 affordable rental. This was in 2021. I expect by the time this comes back around in 2026, 2027, it's going to be high 20s, low 30s. Because every year you wait, that building has to get taller to make the CMHC math work. Here's another example, an office building. City of Toronto, city-owned office building right near Rosedale subway station. It's a 6-story office building. The city had proposed that at 21 stories and 185 residences originally. We helped encourage them to do more. You can see there's a lot of green space. There's a park to the north. There's a ravine there as well. We live in the Northern Hemisphere. If you're going to put a slightly taller building, there's no way I can avoid casting a shadow to the north at some point. But we were able to take that building, take it from its 21 stories and 223 total bedrooms to 32 stories and 346 total bedrooms, which makes the financing more valuable. And it also means that it's easier to take that building from what was going to originally be condo and affordable ownership like Habitat and convert it into market rental and affordable rental mixed use, kind of like a co-op building. So adding the height, adding the density, giving yourself enough gross floor area for the apartments means that you're able to qualify for the federal funding more easily. I think this is probably the last one here. So this is a building in City Place. City Place is right next to the CN Tower. It's right next to the Rogers Centre, heart of downtown Toronto. In 2017, the City of Toronto, on a parcel of its own land, proposed a 9-story building there. Because in 2017, we didn't have a housing crisis. In 2017, we didn't have the Housing Now program. In 2017, we were going to just build a 9-story building there. They awarded that 9-story building, went out to a market developer who was going to partner with the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, and they could not get the funding from CMHC. We came back in February of 2020, after the Housing Now program was in place, and said, this project is clearly dead. It should probably have never gone out to market at 9 stories to begin with. Realistically, we think you need to start at about 22 stories. And in October of 2021, the city brought it in at 27 stories again. So this is a repeating story you're going to hear over and over again when we talk about these, that the city was, to some degree, afraid of its own shadows. And it was very timid about how it was going to execute on its own lands. There's a sense that people who are in the development industry are all evil mustache-twirling developers. But if you talk to the indwells, if you talk to the habitats, if you talk to any of the folks who are in the affordable housing spectrum, they have exactly the same problems that the market developers have. But they have the additional problem that if a market developer is constrained or delayed, they can always increase the condo cost or increase the rents to cover that spread. If we're trying to build units that won't rent for anything more than $1,860 in your case, we have to work at that fixed budget and then work down from there. So every delay, every problem that comes up, all that does is it increases the amount of subsidy you're going to need to provide. So as regional governments, if you want to provide less subsidy per unit, go faster and go higher on all of these sites that you have available to you. Lots of stuff that we do in helping to provide information. We do a lot of stuff with the media. We do a lot of stuff with candidates of all kinds. We've also done our tours in Toronto for people from the region of Waterloo. We'd be happy to do that for any of your groups ever come into the city. You don't have to come all the way into the city. We can do stuff out by sort of Kipling and Islington subway station. There's a bunch of sites there. And we really try to put a public face on where these opportunity sites are around the city for all levels of government. And we talk to everybody. We are a politically agnostic group. We talk to the mayor and the premier and the housing ministers, both. We don't care what party you're with. We just all want you using real numbers when you're talking about housing policy. So I know we're probably right up against time here, but I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. There's supposed to be a microphone somewhere. The microphone is there, so if anybody has a question, please just raise your hand and we will pass the microphone to you. There's a question at the back.
Thanks kindly for your remarks. The emphasis in this presentation, given Toronto, is on height, it's on towers. I'm just wondering, when you're up against the blob, is it forcing the, let's call it, less sustainable height and density into tower forms? Because in order to sustain the level of effort that you need to get the project to go, you've got to use the only thing you can, which is to push that height.
Yeah, and let's be clear that the sites we're talking about here are not that tall. I don't think I talked about anything over about 25 stories. Whereas in Toronto, and I think even here in Waterloo, you're now getting projects that are going into the low to mid 40s, right? So Toronto has a very specific constraint. The constraint that Toronto has is that they came out with these tower guidelines in 2013, which suggests that the individual floors of each building shouldn't be any bigger than 750 square meters. Which means by the time you take out elevators, you take out hallways, you take out garbage chutes and servicing, you're only getting about 9 or 10 units per floor. There are some newer projects that are coming in now where they are going back to a larger floor plate where you're getting over like almost 1,100 square meters on a tower, which means that you're able to generate the same amount of height you would get in a 40-story building in a 19-story building. So it's really just about how we choose to, how we choose to deliver. So the baseline, the smallest project we talked about was this mass timber site at 10 stories. So in Toronto, 10 stories is not a tower. I'm sure there are places in Waterloo Region where proposing a 10-story building brings out the torches and pitchforks, right? But if you want affordable housing and you want to deliver, I think it was 19,000 units, each project needs to maximize its opportunity. So a building that might have been 4 stories in the past may need to be 8, 10, 12 stories now. You may need to be slightly more flexible on your parking requirements, on your shadow concerns. There's no perfect choice here, but we know what the federal government will fund, and we know what the federal government won't fund, and we know that there's a long lineup of municipalities and governments lining up for the money, and there's a finite amount of federal dollars available. So it's your responsibility as a region to make sure that you are putting projects out there that will compare well when compared to dollars that could go to Ottawa or Barrie or to Toronto in comparison. And a heightened density is, it's not so much the heightened density as it is the number of units generated and the dollars per door required to make that project viable that you're being measured on. So these are the ways that that you sort of have to, you have to work the system to make it work. Got another question anywhere? Yeah. Oh,
Hi.
sorry, there's a microphone coming your way.
Microphone coming for you.
Hi, thank you for your informative presentation. This is awesome. Has Housing Now ever run into problems related to height and flight plans? Example for Pearson Airport.
We haven't run into flight plan issues at Pearson. We ran into flight plan issues at, you remember the old Toronto bus depot at Bay and Dundas where the Greyhounds all used to come in when we used to have Greyhounds? That is a city-owned site. And the city had originally put a low 40s tower on there as part of that modern TO program. So the same program as this building. And the flight paths for the orange ambulance helicopters getting into Sick Kids, getting into Toronto General, and getting into St. Mike's were just changed about 2 months ago through a minister's zoning order. And that took 11 floors off that building. But the nice thing is that the other tower was going to be shorter, so a lot of, like, there was going to be 2 towers in the development with a shared podium. So the building that is impacted by the change in the flight path is now moving over, that heightened density is moving to the tower that's outside of the flight path constraints. We're looking at the Toronto Portlands and Villiers Island, which is at Toronto City Council this week. And the Island Airport is right there. There's a number of changes to escape paths and diverted flight paths and stuff that is changing federally. So they've had to be very careful about the heights and densities that they're doing there. We haven't had anything at at Pearson. The other one that was impacted is one of the very first Housing Now sites was at Wilson subway station, which is on the south end of the Downsview Airport, where Bombardier used to build planes. But obviously, Bombardier no longer builds planes there now. It's no longer a working airport. They've got the big red X's on the end of it. So future developments in that area will no longer be limited. I think they were limited to like 12 or 14 stories. The future developments in that area will no longer be limited, and there's federal land, there's City of Toronto land. I know Mark Saunders came out on that tour with us last year when he was running. There's a lot of opportunities there. So flight paths do have an impact, but they've changed in both ways. They've gotten worse in some places, but gotten much better in others as airports have closed. Do we have time for one last one? Here. Oh. Yeah, wherever you.
Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. That was fabulous. Just asking, does the CMHC math differ for each region, or is it across the board? Do you know that?
Unfortunately, it doesn't. It doesn't differ enough, I would say. And we have this conversation. The CMHC likes to have federal programs and federal dollar values. And part of the challenge with that is it costs about $500,000 a unit to build an affordable housing apartment in Toronto, even on government-owned lands. $500,000 in Moose Jaw buys you a really nice, like, quarter-acre lot bungalow, right? So having those dollars be equal in all parts of the country when your build costs and your land costs are very different. What the CMHC and Infrastructure Canada and the Infrastructure Bank are starting to do now is they are starting to treat transit-oriented development different than other affordable housing types. So in the case of the City of Toronto, if we're building something at a GO station, at a subway station, along the new Ontario line, along the Scarborough subway extension, here if you're building stuff along your new ION LRT line, then there are programs that sort of give you additional dollars because it's transit-oriented development. They've given you money for the transit, and they're expecting the development to go along with the transit, so therefore they know that they need to tie those two things together. But it's still, it's not as generous as it probably needs to be, or as market-specific as it needs to be. But we have very good relationships with the folks at CMHC and in the Minister's office in Ottawa. And you know, the benefit of the kind of work we do is we can show, here's a project that would work in Waterloo, take that same project and put it on the same size parking lot in Toronto, and it no longer works. So how do we fill that gap financially by treating the microeconomic conditions of those communities differently? I think that's probably it for my time, Oliver. So I'm around the rest of the day today. If you have any questions, and these slides are all available. There's links to a lot of our research materials at the back. You're also free to send me an email or grab me at the break. One.
For Best Architects of Waterloo,
Yep.
we're working on an affordable housing project in Kitchener right now for the Hellenic community.
Yep.
And I thank you for your presentation, very educational. Thank you very much. I heard you saying that to meet the criteria of CMHC for financing, you added from 15 floors to 25 to 32.
In Toronto, whether we'd need to do that here.
The president of that organization is here, and we've been 4 years working on that project. Started construction very recently, 2 weeks ago. For 4 years of an agony trying to get the project to 25 meters that the zoning by law allowed. We went through a zone change, official plan amendment, site plan approval, 25 meters, that's what you get. And we could have used 3 or 4 more floors. 5 blocks away from us has been allowed a 32-floor story.
Yep.
We went back, how is this possible? What about us? How do you deal with that?
We're lucky in that the majority of the sites we work on are City of Toronto identified sites. So they're city-owned lands. And we are able to say to the city, you have this Housing Now program, which requires a 99-year land lease and 1/3 of the units to be affordable rental for 99 years. When we first came to the table in 2019 and questioned some of their math, we were the barbarians at the gate. We didn't know what we were talking about, right? But over the years, everything that we had suggested to them that they would need to do in order to qualify for federal funding has come true. So we've earned a bunch of trust as an organization by predicting the future. That this site, we had one building that started at 15 stories for an Indigenous organization. We came back to them and said, we can't see how this works. It was 15 stories, 150 units. We came back to them within 2 months and said, we don't see how this works at under 26 stories and 290 units. They said, you're wrong. They came back at 18 stories and 180 units. They awarded it to an Indigenous organization back in 2019 or 2020. The Indigenous organization and their construction partners at Ellis Don came back last year at 29 stories and 290 units. And each one of those units now costs about $120,000 more in 2024 than it would have cost in 2019 if we had just ripped off the Band-Aid and done the appropriate zoning as we'd suggested in 2019. So we don't like to show up and say, I told you so. We don't like to show up and dunk on people, but we do explain that gap in the math. Working with the university students has been very helpful. I don't know what your relationship is like with University of Waterloo or some of the other planning schools out here, but the more information you can put into the public domain, the more you can iterate those different flavors of the buildings and share your pro formas publicly, like everything we do is in the public domain. That helps make the political case with the politicians, and sometimes a project needs to fail or be in deep trouble before people will accept that they need to do some politically unpopular things on height, on density, on parking, on shadows, whatever it is.